Hello, everybody. Hope you are all doing well. I'm here with Chapter 10 of Book 1 of the Ranger's Apprentice The Early Years series, The Tournament at Gorlan, and we're going to go ahead and get into it. At this time of day, most of the village's inhabitants were in the fields, tending crops and mowing the hay. As a result, the main street was virtually deserted. Then, a little boy darted out of one of the cottages, shrieking with laughter, looking back over his shoulder, and very nearly going under the hoofs of Crowley's horse. The horse shied, and Crowley heaved on the reins, pulling it clear of the boy, who had stopped, petrified with fear. Crowley's horse, like most ranger horses, wasn't as imposing as a battle horse or a plow horse, but viewed from a 10-year-old's perspective, it seemed enormous. Crowley settled his horse, patting its neck and making sure the animal was calmed down. "You should watch where you're going, young fellow," he said, smiling at the boy. The boy knuckled his forehead apologetically. In spite of the smile, the figure towering over him seemed grim and forbidding. "My apologies, sir," he said, his voice coming out as a squeak. He looked to Crowley's companion, and his nervousness increased. The second rider was black-bearded, and had a bad-tempered look to him, with heavy black eyebrows framing his dark, piercing eyes. Again, the boy knuckled his forehead. Halt added to his discomfort by remaining silent. "Sam Crofter, where are you, you wicked boy?" The boy glanced over his shoulder as the voice rang out through the street. An elderly woman emerged from one of the cottages, looking up and down the village, before setting eyes on the boy. She hurried forward, limping as she tried to run and gather him in. Like the boy, she looked nervously at the two riders. They were cloaked and had their cowls up, and both of them were armed. They carried massive longbows, and she could see the hilts of weapons at their waists. She made surprisingly good speed in spite of the limp, and seized the boy by the ear. He wriggled and howled in protest. "My apologies, your honors," she said. "I hope the boy wasn't bothering you." As she said it, she gave his ear a good twist, evoking another howl from him. Crowley grinned at her. She was the boy's grandmother, he guessed, too old for the heavy work in the fields, and further disadvantaged by the twisted leg that gave her the limp. She would be tasked with looking after the boy during working hours, leaving her daughter free to help work the farm. "He's not bothered us, Mother," Crowley said easily. His tone was friendly, and realizing that the cowl of his cloak might make him look a little sinister, he pushed it back, revealing his honest, open features. The woman seemed reassured by his friendly tone. Nonetheless, she maintained an air of reserve. Trust was all very well, her attitude seemed to say, but in these uncertain times, mistrust was better. "Tell me, where would we find the local ranger?" Crowley asked, and the woman's eyes clouded with suspicion once more. "Would that be the new ranger?" she asked, "or the real ranger, who's been here these past 10 years or more?" Halt and Crowley exchanged a quick glance. So Leander had already been replaced. The woman's choice of words was interesting. She referred to Leander as the real ranger. That seemed to indicate that she regarded Morgarath's new appointee as something of a usurper. Not surprising, Halt thought. She was an older woman, and was probably used to the old ways. Older people tended to resent and distrust change as a matter of course. In this case, he thought, the distrust was well placed. Ranger Leander, Crowley elaborated. The woman's distrust faded a little. She studied them more closely. The boy, finally working his ear free of her vice-like grip, scuttled away to their cottage. "You're rangers yourselves, are you?" she asked. Their clothing and equipment seemed to make it clear that they were. Plus, their cloaks were drab and unremarkable, ideal for remaining unseen in the green and gray shadows of the woods. The new ranger, whom she'd seen once or twice, favored a shiny satin cloak in rich green. Even among the green foliage of the forest, it stood out like a beacon. "That's right," Crowley replied. It seemed easier than explaining Halt's uncertain status each time. The old woman nodded. "Thought so," she said. "And you're of the old school." Obviously, she approved of what she referred to as the old school. She jerked her head up toward the castle, which dominated the landscape. "That new man, Littlefoot, lives up at the castle. Leander has always stayed down here, among us, where he could help if we needed it. Drank in the tavern here, talked to the children, listened to the men when they had trouble with a bear or a wolf taking their animals. The new man cares nothing for us. He wouldn't know one of us if he fell over us." Halt was impressed by her confidence. Crowley had told him that the common folk sometimes viewed rangers with suspicion, thinking they might be versed in the ways of the occult. Obviously, this woman was old enough to ignore such superstitious nonsense. She'd seen how Leander lived and operated, and knew he was a man to be trusted. "So Leander has moved on, has he?" he asked her. "He has not," she assured them. "He's still in his cabin, although Baron Reamer has sent him several messages telling him he has to move out." She let out a cackle of laughter. "Even went down to tell him personally at one time. Came hurrying back through the village, minus the fine feathered bonnet he'd been wearing." Crowley allowed himself the ghost of a grin. "So where do we find his cabin?" he asked. She pointed to the far end of the village. "Past the village, the road forks. Take the right fork toward the stream, and you'll come to his cabin after 50 or 60 meters. It's among the trees, and not too easy to see until you're almost on it." "Thanks, Mother." Crowley gathered up his reins, which he had let lie loose upon his horse's neck. He clicked his tongue, and his horse moved forward. The woman watched them go. After 5 meters, she called out to them. "One thing, Ranger. Make sure Leander knows you're coming. Wouldn't do to surprise him." Crowley turned back and nodded to her. "I'm sure it wouldn't," he replied. They followed the fork in the road and came to the cabin. It stood in a small clearing among the tall trees. A pleasant-looking little cabin, fashioned from pine logs, and with a roof of slate. "No thatched roof," Halt murmured. The vast majority of roofs were thatched in this part of the country. Slate and tiles were difficult to come by. Crowley nodded. "Thatch burns," he pointed out. The cabin seemed deserted. The door was closed, and the shutters on the 2 windows facing them in the long front wall were both fastened. At least, Halt thought. Peering more closely, they seemed to be. But now he looked, he could see that the left-hand shutter had been pulled closed, but not fastened. There was a narrow gap noticeable between the 2 halves. A small lean-to stood against the rear wall. Crowley indicated it. "That's the stable." Halt surveyed the clearing in which the cabin stood. The trees towered over it on all sides. The cleared ground was some 30 meters across. There was a pump, with a leather bucket hanging from the handle, set close to the veranda, that ran along the longest wall of the cabin, and a woodpile stacked under an open-sided roof structure that would keep most of the rain off it. An axe was driven into a sawn-off tree trunk that obviously served as a chopping block. "Looks like nobody's home," Halt observed. The cabin definitely looked deserted, aside from that small chink in the shutters. As he spoke, they heard a short whinny from the stables. "Someone's home, all right," Crowley told him. "That's a warning signal, and a ranger horse wouldn't make it, unless there was somebody around to hear it. Have you noticed that left-hand shutter? It's not properly fastened." "I noticed," Halt said. Pritchard had trained him to look for little anomalies like that. Noticing small details can help you stay alive, the old ranger had been fond of saying. "Keep an eye on it," Crowley said, out of the corner of his mouth. He shifted his balance in the saddle, then called, "Hello, the cabin!" There was no reply. Halt saw a blur of movement in the narrow gap between the shutters. Then an arrow split the air between them, thudding into a tree some 5 meters behind them, vibrating viciously. Halt's horse shied a few paces sideways. Crowley's, ranger trained, stood stock still. Almost immediately, Halt moved to unsling his longbow from his shoulder, but Crowley threw out a hand to stop him. "Don't," he said, his voice quiet in spite of the urgency of his command. Then added, "He's a ranger. If he wanted to, he could have hit either one of us," and followed up with a second shot at the other. Halt relaxed, letting his bow settle back on his shoulder. Still, there was no word from the cabin, nor could he see any further movement behind the shutters. "We're friends," Crowley called toward the silent cabin. This time, a voice replied. "That's what Reamer said before I shot the fancy feathered bonnet off his fancy feather-brained head." Crowley grinned. "Yes, we'd heard about that in the village," he said. "I take it he's all in favor of your replacement." There was a tone of disgust, obvious in the voice now. "Replacement? Usurper is more like it. That man is no ranger. He's one of Morgarath's stooges. Can't shoot, can't stalk, can barely sit his horse at a walk, let alone a gallop. All he's good for is drinking wine and swishing his satin cloak around his shoulders." Halt smiled grimly at the description. He felt he could picture this new ranger pretty well. "Both valuable skills," he said. Crowley glanced at him, amused. "So who are you two?" Leander demanded. "We're rangers," Crowley told him, "of what's described as the old school." "Step down and let's take a look at you," Leander ordered. And the two men dismounted, stepping clear of the horses and standing shoulder to shoulder. "If you're rangers, one of you should be able to hit that leather bucket on the—" He got no further. In the blink of an eye, Halt unslung his bow, nocked an arrow, and sent it slamming through the middle of the leather bucket hanging from the pump, knocking it clear and sending it bouncing and rolling across the ground in front of the cabin. It was a demonstration of devastating speed and accuracy that only a master bowman could have accomplished. Halt looked at the gap in the shutters, a challenge in his eye. "I was going to say on the pump," Leander said. "You seem to have beaten me to it." "No sense in shooting slowly," Halt called to him. There was a pause. "All right, so you can shoot like a ranger. What are your names?" This time, Crowley answered. "My name's Crowley. I'm from Hogarth Fief. This is Halt. Your name's familiar. Remember you from one of the gatherings a few years back. But I have no idea who he might be." There was a note of challenge, of disbelief, in the voice. "Halt's from Hibernia," Crowley said hurriedly. "He was trained there by my old mentor, Pritchard. Surely you remember him." "Aye, I do. He was one of the best," Leander replied. "So what do you want with me?" We're looking for a few good men to help us, Crowley said, hoping to stimulate Leander's curiosity. The ploy was successful. Help you with what? We're planning to bring down Morgarath, Halt said. There was a long, long pause. Then the door of the cabin slowly opened, and a stocky, clean-shaven man stepped out onto the veranda, a longbow held loosely in his left hand. Now that sounds like something I might enjoy, he said. And that will bring us to the conclusion of chapter number 10. Thank you all for joining me, and thank you for listening. And I'll hope to see you next time in chapter 11. God bless, and have a good one.